As of January 2022, almost 20% of American children were living in poverty, according to Columbia University's Poverty and Social Policy Center. This is almost one-fifth of America's youth that is getting trapped in a vicious poverty cycle that is borderline impossible to escape without outside help. But why are so many kids getting trapped in these appalling living conditions in one of the richest countries on the planet? Of course, poverty is an incredibly complex issue, with many different causes contributing to the problem. That's why, over the past several thousand years of human history, nobody's ever been able to completely eradicate it. But one of the biggest causes of poverty in modern America lies in the education system. According to the NASSP, the National Association of Secondary School Principals, being in poverty will result in a drastically worse education. People in poverty cannot afford tutors, good Wi Fi, computers, and they will often have to work jobs instead of studying, all of which gives poor people a much higher dropout rate and a much lower rate of students going on to college or trade school than the national average. Unfortunately, those who get a bad education are also much more likely to stay in poverty. This means that areas with poorly funded schools will more often than not have a climbing poverty rate. And this climbing rate means that more kids who go to that school will be living in poverty, which means that they will get a worse education, which means that they will come out of school even more poor, which means that their kids will get an even worse education, and the cycle continues on and on and on. You'd think that our school system would have built in mechanisms to help prevent this cycle, but unfortunately, those mechanisms do not exist. In actuality, the school system in its current form exasperates the effect of cycles of poverty. The way that most states pay for schools is by property taxes, which basically means the higher value property a community has, the more money a school will get, and vice versa. This means that poorer communities that have low property values will have poorly funded schools. And because of these poorly funded schools, people will get an even worse education, which will make them more likely to stay poor, which makes the community's economy even worse, which means even less taxes, which means even worse schools, which means even more poor people, which means even less taxes, which means even worse schools. And again, it's a vicious cycle that only continues to exasperate the poverty. The cycles of poverty that have become all too prevalent for America's youth are near impossible to escape on your own. But to show how our community and schools leaders can and should still try to help these kids and how the situation is not by any means hopeless, I would like to share the story of Jordan Lovett. Jordan Lovett is a senior at Lee High School in Alabama. Jordan wants to attend a local community college and become an elementary school teacher, but the poverty she lives in is often a barrier to this. She has had to move frequently from home to home, and in some cases staying in motels. And because of this, she has frequently changed schools, usually in the middle of the school year. Jordan's stepdad has a disability that makes working impossible, and her mom works at a Dollar Tree as a cashier. Jordan's mother said in an interview with School News Network, "I've been on my own since I was 15 or 16 years old. It's been a rough struggle for me. I've done what I could to get food on the table and keep a roof over their heads. I succeeded barely, but I did it." Lee has been able to make do despite living in poverty by getting in contact with school staff and getting help from the school district and the government. She is on free lunch, and the school has helped pay for fees and other expenses that her family hasn't been able to cover. She has also taken advantage of dual credit and AP classes in order to get the price of community college down to a more acceptable level. This proves that with the help of a well funded school district, students can overcome and escape these cycles of poverty. But there is a caveat to that. Jordan may be personally poor, but the surrounding community is not particularly rich, but not particularly poor either. And because of this, the school district has much more funding to help Jordan fight against poverty. But most of America's impoverished will not have access to that kind of help because their school districts have nowhere near the resources they need to get that done. This brings me to my answer to Alliance Credit Union scholarship question. If I had the authority, what change would I make to create a positive change in my community? The decision that I believe would be most impactful in breaking cycles of poverty would be to change the way our schools are funded. Instead of the current property tax system, which only works to make the kids of the rich richer and the kids of the poor poorer, we should have a system that helps give the poor an equal playing field with the kids of wealthy parents. I would make it so that the poorest and worst funded schools would receive the biggest budget increases, while the richer, well funded schools would not have their funding increased until the poorer schools have been allowed to catch up. I believe that this change would work wonders to help fight against poverty in our community if implemented. Thank you for your time.